doing lots of interviews at work recently, and as some of you will know of the big changes in my admin team at school, and so we've been interviewing and trying to fill those posts. And we had our interviews for a new deputy head teacher at the school this week, and we're great. We managed to appoint what I believe is going to be a fantastic deputy to come work with me and my other deputy to lead the school. So I'm really, really looking forward to that in January. But one of the questions I like to ask, one of the questions I like to ask candidates to interview is this one. What makes you angry?
Children you recently teased and blamed you.
Yes. When I ask the question in the interview, often the first response people give, because they're trying to give a good impression, aren't they, in the interview, is, "Oh, I never get angry." That's the first answer usually when they say, but what I do is I give them a little bit of time. We don't rush on to the next question. We kind of hold back a bit. And we just give a little bit of time, and then they start to think of things. And it's quite interesting what people come up with. People will say things like, litter in the countryside makes them angry. Or rude people. Quite a lot of people mention driving, and the traffic, or inconsiderate drivers. Some will mention bigger things like climate change or environmental issues, and occasionally some will talk about injustice and how injustice makes them angry, or inequality, those kind of things. One person answered, they said, well, what makes me angry are people who ask irritating, stupid questions at interviews. I don't think they got the job. I wonder what makes you angry. What actually makes you angry? We've been spending I thought it was just going to be over the summer that we were going to focus on a little series on Jesus, but it just grew and grew, and there was more and more to focus on. So we carried on, we're going to carry on right through November as well. And we've been thinking a lot about the characteristics of who Jesus is. Alright? What makes Jesus angry? What makes Jesus angry? Does anything make him angry? Well, to help us answer that, I want to take us back just very briefly to one of the sermons we had a few weeks ago, which is all about Christ's compassion for us. His compassion. You see, Jesus has compassion on all that he has made. He cares for us, doesn't he? He cares about us. He loves us with immeasurable love, doesn't he? And his compassion, do you remember, I talked about the fact that the Jews, who had this whole thing about being unclean, if they saw a situation that would make them unclean, they turned away, didn't they? They would go nowhere near an unclean person or a dead animal or anything like that, or food that they weren't allowed to touch. They would go in the opposite direction. They wouldn't dream of going near it. But what we see in Jesus, his compassion, meant he turned towards the uncleanness. He goes towards the very thing that is unclean. And he goes and he actually embraces it and touches, like the sick. He touches. And it's not that they then make him unclean. He makes them clean. That's his compassion on display. His compassion causes him to act, doesn't it? It enables him to act. And one of the things that happens because of Jesus' compassion for us is that he actually gets angry. He actually gets angry. Have you ever noticed that when someone you love experiences pain, or perhaps experiences distress because of illness, or because someone else has done them wrong, you find yourself getting angry? You ever noticed that? Or when a child, your child, gets separated to you when you're out shopping and you can't find them anywhere and you are desperately looking for them, and eventually after searching, there they are hiding behind the coats in the clothes department, and your first response is an angry response, isn't it? Because it's your compassion, your love for them that stirs you up and, where do you mean? Because you're worried about them. Well, just imagine then how Jesus, the morally perfect one, is impacted when those he loves face trouble. Or those he loves are sinned against. His compassion leads him to anger. It's perfect anger. It's anger without any sin, righteous anger, but he does get angry. Now, if Jesus wasn't compassionate, if he wasn't compassionate towards all that he's made, then I'm not sure he would ever get angry. He wouldn't get angry over injustice, he wouldn't get angry over sickness, because he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have cared about the mistreatment of women, or the unborn child. But Jesus is compassionate. And so, as his compassion rises, so does his anger rise. So does Jesus ever get angry? Yes. We're going to look at a couple of examples just to help us see it. So if you've got a Bible, turn to Matthew 18, 1, verse 1. We'll start reading, I'll start reading verse 2. So the disciples were saying, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That's the question they just asked him. And what does he do? Jesus calls a little child and has the child stand among them. And then he said to them, I can guarantee this truth. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes like this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a child like this in my name welcomes me. So Jesus has, we can see here, compassion for children, doesn't he? He then shows us a glimpse of how his compassion leads to anger. Look at verse 6. That's what it says. These little ones believe in me. It will be best for the person who causes one of them to lose faith to be drowned in the sea with a large stone hung around his neck. Children are precious to Jesus. They're vulnerable, aren't they? Easily wronged, easily influenced by false teaching and false ideas. And Jesus' compassion for them leads to anger towards anyone who caused them to lose faith. Anyone to do anything to one of his children causes him to anger. And we see it rising up in the statement. He says, it's better that they drown with a millstone around their neck. Can you imagine that scene when he said it? That's pretty horrific, isn't it? That's pretty violent. Shutting someone to drown with a stone tied down their neck. But that's how compassionate Jesus is towards his children. There's also a very well-known moment when Jesus displays characteristics that I think really shocked, surprised all those around him. I think it still does today, and that's in John chapter 2. John 2, verse 13. Many of you will know this event. So the Jewish Passover was near, and so Jesus went to Jerusalem. He found those who were selling cattle, sheep, and pigeons in the temple courtyard. He also found money changers sitting there. So what's going on here in John chapter 2? Well, the temple, the place where heaven and earth most clearly came together at that time. The place where God had chosen to dwell. His very being, dwelling amongst the people. The place where Jews and other non-Jewish believers could come to worship God, to sacrifice, to pray, to fellowship with God. That's the backdrop of this moment, this event in Jesus' life, where we see in a moment Jesus get extremely angry. Now people were coming from long distances, weren't they? They were coming and travelling to the temple to sacrifice. And it was impractical for them to bring lambs or birds or cattle with them all that journey for the sacrifice. It was much easier for them. It was much easier for them to buy what they needed in Jerusalem. Far easier. So market stalls were there, offering them cattle, sheep, pigeons. But these stalls weren't just in the streets of Jerusalem. These stalls had made their home in one of the courtyards of the temple. And because they were inside the grounds of the temple, people couldn't just use their normal currency to buy things. They weren't allowed to use the Roman currency inside the temple. Can't do that. So they had to then change their money into temple money, which is why we then had the money changers setting up stalls in the courtyard too. And on seeing all that was going on in the temple, what does Jesus do? He made a whip from small ropes and threw everyone with their sheep and cattle out of the temple courtyard, didn't he? He dumped the money changers' coins and knocked over the tables. He told those who sold pigeons, pick up this stuff and get out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. Can you imagine just before that moment? Just imagine just before that moment, Jesus is sat with some small bits of rope and he's weaving them into a whip. That's what we're told. He made the whip. He didn't go and buy it. He sat there, premeditated. He knew what he was going to do. It wasn't the anger of, I've lost my child, where are they, anger? Or someone's just cut me up on the motorway and I get angry. It wasn't that. It was a premeditated, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to act. Because anger is rising up in Jesus because of his compassion. We'll see why in a moment. Two reasons why I want to just suggest that Jesus got angry. Alright? The first one is linked to his compassion, his love. But it was his love for his Father, I think. His love for his Father. When he saw how people were dishonouring God in the temple courtyards, he became angry. Now the temple was the place to meet God. The temple was the place to go to pray to God. And it was a place for worship. But what had happened is that courtyard was no longer a place where people focused on God. Actually had become a place where people were focusing on money. They were focusing on money, on transactions, on making profit, on making a quick buck. Money is such a grabber of our hearts, of our worship, isn't it? It's so easy for money to grab hold of us and take our eyes off of God and put it onto other stuff. And God's house, God's place of worship, had become a place where worshipping of money took over worshipping of God. So that's one reason I believe Jesus got angry. But there's another one I want to look at. In Luke's account, when Luke writes about this moment, in Luke 19, verse 17, it says this: Jesus declared this. This is what Jesus says. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you've made it a den of robbers. See, the people were being done over, weren't they? They were being done over. It's a bit like, when you go to a motorway service station and you see the cost of a coffee. And you think, how can they charge that much for a coffee? But they've got you, haven't they? There's nowhere else to get one. That's the only place you can buy a coffee for the next 40, 50 miles, so they can put the price up. It was the same like that in the temple. because there was nowhere else to get your sacrifice. There was nowhere else to change your money, so they could be robbing the people. But I reckon there's something else that made Jesus angry. He said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations." For all the nations. It was always God's intention that Israel, that Jewish nation, would be a blessing to other nations. That through them, all nations would come to know God and know His love for them. That was the whole plan. But as Jesus looked at the courtyard there in the temple, it had become this marketplace with bleating lambs and mooing cattle and a noise of commerce. And he was angered because it was no longer a place of prayer for the nations. This whole scene is taking place in one of the courtyards. Right? One of the courtyards of the temple. And there were a few courtyards in the way the temple was built. There was the courtyard of the priests. So that was where the Levites could go to worship and to fellowship together. There was the court of Israel. That was just for Jewish men to go into. There was the court of women. That was just for Jewish women. And then finally there was the court of the Gentiles. And the court of the Gentiles was an area for non-Jews to come. For non-Jews to come into the presence of God and to worship and pray. And it is believed by some of those that have looked into this far more than I have, that it was in that courtyard of the Gentiles, where all the animals were being sold, where the money changers were setting up their stalls. It was in that area, that courtyard. A courtyard set aside for those that weren't Jewish to go and come into the presence of God. And Jesus quotes Isaiah in this, and he reminds us all that God is for all people groups. God's heart is for all classes of people, all cultures. God is for them. And the authorities at the time, allowing a market to be situated in that courtyard, were making it just about impossible for the nations to come and worship God. It would be impossible in all that noise and mess and smell. Like that, can you imagine it? Simon repaired that. How many times have you tried? 3 times. I think we need to get a new one. So that whole noise and clutter and clang, that was good, wasn't it? Made it impossible. And this made Jesus angry. Because he has compassion for all nations, for all peoples, doesn't he? And Jesus longs for the nations to come to him, and anyone who gets in their way, anyone that puts something in the way and stops them coming to be with Jesus, well, he's prepared to make a whip. He's prepared to turn tables over. He's prepared to drive people out if they're going to be a barrier to others coming to know him. Now, did the Jews do this deliberately? Had they done it deliberately to stop non-Jews coming in? I don't know. I think probably it just kind of happened. Because it suited them, didn't it? It kept it all together. It made life easier for them. If they can pilgrimage to Jerusalem, get to the temple, I can see it on the hills, so I know where I'm going. When I get there, I can buy my sheep. It made it easy for everybody. It was convenient. But it stopped others coming to God. I just want to give you a moment to think. Are there things we do? Are there things you do that actually stop others coming to meet Jesus? unintentionally, but aren't they? Style of music, perhaps, that we use. Length of the service. Don't know. The time we hold our meetings. We've always been around 10:30. That's what we do church. But is it a barrier? Have we not got a great enough presence online as a church? Because that's where most people are. Do we as personal individuals need to be better prepared to share our story and the good news of Jesus? Because actually that's the biggest barrier to many people knowing about Jesus, isn't it? That we don't share it. I don't think the Jews deliberately put the mark in there. I don't think so. Perhaps the priests were making money quite well out of it. Perhaps they were quite keen on it. But I think it probably just grew up and happened. Just wonder. Take stock for a moment. Are there any barriers? Any barriers we've got? Jesus still gets angry today, doesn't he? I'm sure he does. Alright? He gets angry today because he loves so much that when things happen, he can't stay indifferent to them. He can't. Because his compassion moves him to act. His anger actually is reflecting his heart. His compassion moves him to be angry. And as the people of God, as his church, another thing I want to think about. Are you angry? Are you angry? Don't be too quick to assume your anger is sinful. There may be situations, there might even be systems, governmental systems, cultural systems in place, circumstances where, do you know what, your compassion for others leads you to anger. And just as Jesus turns towards the unclean to love and make clean, it may be that God is stirring in you a compassion for people, a compassion for a group of people perhaps. It might be compassion for one person. But as you're saying, just turn towards them. Turn towards them. Move towards them. Show my compassion. Allow your anger that it shouldn't be like this to stir you to act. It might be some big things. It might be things like the unborn child. That might be something that makes you angry when you look at what goes on. And you think, I've got to act, I've got to do something. Perhaps it's trafficking of women. That really going on? Yes, it's going on. And that might be something you're getting angry about because you're stirring you. You think, I just want to do something to help. So for me, that I'm more and more aware of is the whole safeguarding of children in our vulnerable world. Probably my job being a head teacher, but I am shocked actually to think how awful it has been for so many children during COVID. You know, the number of social service cases that my school is involved in now than before COVID is probably 4 or 5 times more than we've ever known. These children are in very dangerous, vulnerable places. And my heart, I get angry actually about it, if I'm honest, and sometimes my conversations with parents are a bit firm and forceful because actually they should be doing something better for these children. It's not acceptable. So there might be some big thing in you that you just feel God stirring in me. I keep reading articles about it and I realise, actually God, are you calling me to act? Are you calling me to do something? Then I want to say to you, do it. Do it. Find a way to act. You need to guard your heart, of course you do. You need to guard your heart because being angry can so easily lead to sin. But do something. Perhaps it's on a personal note. Perhaps you've seen loved ones hurt. You've seen loved ones abused by others. And your love for them leads you to anger. Or perhaps you've been hurt or mistreated yourself, and there is this anger that's inside you. You know that this is not how it should be. Well, the psalmist said in Psalm 4, be angry. Be angry. Don't hear that very often, do we? But be angry. Because that's not how it's meant to be. It goes on to say this though. All right, be angry and do not sin. And that's tough, that's a hard one. But it says this, reflect in your heart while on your bed, be silent. There's something about reflecting. Yes, I'm feeling angry about this, but stop, reflect, be silent. When you're silent, who can you hear? You can hear God, can't you? You can hear Him and allow Him to guide you in what you do about it. Paul expands it a little bit more. Paul, in his letter to Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 26, he says this, be angry and do not sin. So he's quoting Psalm 4 there. Be angry and do not sin. And then he takes this whole being on your bed thing a little bit further, because he says then, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Just say to those of you that are married, alright? There's nothing really worse than going to bed after an argument and you're both in that bed and you've both got your backs to each other and you really aren't reconciled. Don't do it. Alright? Not because I'm telling you, but because Paul's telling you. It's biblical. Alright? Deal with it. Work it through. Not just within marriage, but with your kids as well. Don't send them off to their bedrooms and ignore them for a few hours and let them go to sleep. Alright? If you're angry with them, go and reconcile. So important. Relationships, in work, in church. Yeah, church is one of the places that people get angry with each other, can't we? I didn't put the chairs in the right place, or the coffee wasn't quite hot enough, or I don't know, people get angry over the strangest things, don't they? But we do. I want to encourage you. When you feel anger rising in yourself, reflect in your heart. Lie in your bed, alright? Contemplate what has been done to you or to others, and allow Jesus to be angry with you. Allow him to be angry on your behalf. You can trust his anger. His anger is without any sin. Alright? Because his anger wells up because he's compassionate for you. He is for you. And I want to say this, just as we close. Let Jesus be angry for you and allow his love to move you to a place of forgiveness towards the one who sinned against you. Allow his love to lead you to a place of forgiveness. That's not saying what the person's done was right. It's not saying that person shouldn't face a consequence for what they've done. It's not about that. It's about you. A need to come to a place of forgiveness. Because, you know, when we don't allow forgiveness to take over and we hold on to it, you know what? We are chained to that event. We are chained to that person that did that thing to us. And it's through forgiveness that we take the bolt proppers and we set ourselves free from it. It's the only way to set yourself free from the stuff that's been done to you. Just as Jesus forgave those who nailed him to the cross, didn't he? He did it while he was still hanging there. Father, forgive them. Just as he was able to forgive those who nailed to the cross, we too can, by his power and his love, forgive others who have done wrong to us. It's not easy, but it sets us free. So if you're angry about a big thing and you feel God stirring you to act, I want to say to you, as Trinity Church, be released to do something. Yeah? Doesn't have to be a big church kind of initiative. Doesn't have to have a budget. Doesn't have to have any of that. If you feel God stirring your heart to do something, do it. Speak up. Speak out. Move towards the unlovely and do something. But if, as I've been speaking, something has come to mind in your own heart, and you realise, oh shit, I'm angry towards that situation, I'm angry towards that person. Kelly, I want you to just come play. Just going to have a few moments. I want to give you some time just to... I'm not the one to deal with it. Bring it to Jesus. All right, bring it to him. So it's really okay to play. Let's sing. We just have some music. Do you know what? There are situations in life, even it may go back 30, 40, 50 years, that something just comes to mind and you go, yeah, that was done to me. Do you know what? Jesus is angry too about that. Allow him to be angry and ask him to help you to forgive and be set free from the chains that bound you to that thing. So as Curly plays, I'll just be still. Be still. Notes, but I just feel I should bring this. There's a third time when I think Jesus was angry, and that's when he was stood outside the tomb of Lazarus, his dear friend. He was angry because death was not how it was meant to be. Sickness and suffering is not how God intended it to be. And as he stood outside that tomb and he called to Lazarus, come out! Right? He was setting him free, wasn't he, from the bondage of death and decay. And you know what? That's Jesus' whole mission. He was so angry about the situation that he was prepared to come amongst us, live amongst us, die so that death could be defeated, so that he could set everything right and we can find new life in him. And so he's angry about sickness too. And so if you are sick and you're angry about the fact you are struggling with long-term illness, I want to say to you now, bring it to Jesus again and ask him, because he's angry too. There will be a day when there's no more death. There will be a day when there's no more sickness. There will be a day when there are no more children being damaged by adults. There will be a day when there will be no more women being captured and trafficked for sex. There will be a day, but right now, join with Jesus to see his kingdom come. His will be done on earth as it is